6'2", powerful security boss pushed his way through the crowded bar with a confident stride, focusing in on his target. He quickly spotted a shaven-headed, tattooed thug approaching from his left side, swinging a haymaker punch. Without missing a stride, he blocked the punch and right hooked the man, knocking his teeth out, rendering him unconscious. Blackpool's infamous security boss, Steve Sinclair, had landed in Salford, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Steve Sinclair, a former amateur boxer who once fought an exhibition match against Sugar Ray Leonard aboard a cruise ship, is not your average bouncer type. Big in stature, with an imposing figure, Sinclair cut a smart figure with a politeness that hid a ruthless streak, which would rise him to the top of the security industry in his adopted home of Blackpool and beyond. Sinclair had an interesting background: short time in the Merchant Navy, a stint in the 70s running with Portsmouth hooligan crew, before enrolling as a Royal Engineer in the Army in the late 70s, where he became captain of the boxing team and light heavyweight champion. It was these early years of combined experience that would set him in good stead to become a formidable doorman in Blackpool who garnered respect from across the country. To give an insight into the respect Steve Sinclair's name held during the heavy years of the 80s and 90s within the security industry and beyond, I asked Paul Ferris his thoughts on Steve Sinclair, as he and his brother Billy Ferris were mentioned in his book, Blackpool Rock. Paul confirmed that the account in Steve's book about the visit from himself and the notorious gangster Rab Carruthers to Blackpool was accurate, and that in his era, Steve was well respected across the country as being firm but fair. So the question is, how and why did Steve Sinclair end up in Salford, getting into a violent brawl with a protection racket firm, causing havoc amongst the pubs, terrorising landlords, extorting money, or burning pubs down? In 1994, the investigative journalist Roger Cook from the Cook Report ran a sting operation on a gang running protection on pubs in the Salford area. The men highlighted in the episode were thought to be working for more powerful criminals behind the scenes. The late Paul Massey, the Mr. Big of Salford, was often linked to all types of criminal behaviour in Salford and Manchester especially, and had an interest in security doors alongside the infamous Noonan brothers. In Paul One Punch Doyle's book, he describes the war himself and the violent Graham Boardman had in the early 2000s with Paul Massey and his friends over certain doors within Salford and Greater Manchester. In respect to this incident involving Steve Sinclair and the Salford protection ring, Paul Massey was in prison, so he was not directly involved physically, but the Salford lads involved would have been known to Massey. To give the exact account of what happened in this brutal encounter, I will read the extract from Steve Sinclair's book, Blackpool Rock. To give context to the following audio reading from the Blackpool Rock, Stephen Sinclair and friends had decided to drive down one Sunday afternoon to Salford to see an old pal of theirs who they used to work the door with, Peter. He was running the Adelphi pub on the riverside near Salford University. Later in the day, we were joined by Stephen Heap, Peter's cousin. Steve was a big man and had worked the doors in Blackpool himself. He was now running a pub in Eccles, just a few miles down the road. I had met him a few times and liked him. He had a good, solid reputation in the Blackpool area. As the afternoon moved into the evening, the pub was still quite busy. Andy, Steve and I were sat talking to some nice people we had just met when a team of lads, about 12 strong, came walking into the pub. To say they looked out of place would be an understatement. I could only describe them as toe rags who thought they were the boys. They were glaring at the customers nearest to them and jostling people out of the way. As Peter came from the office, he saw this team of lads and his face went white. He turned quickly and disappeared back the way he had come. I had been seen taking an interest by one of the gang, and as Peter disappeared, I stood up and started walking towards them to find out what was happening with my pal. Obviously, I had half an idea who they were, but they didn't have a clue who I was. The individual who had seen me moving spoke to the one I suspect was their leader. He looked at me and stepped forward. "What the fuck do you want?" he growled. I just punched him on the chin and kept on walking forward as he fell to the ground. The biggest one of the toe rags, who had tattoos on his neck and hands and a shaven head, took out his false teeth and rushed at me. I blocked a wild punch from him with my left arm, grabbed his throat with my right hand, and lifted and twisted at the same time. His own momentum caused his legs to leave the ground and travel upwards to my waist height. I then slammed him down back first onto the floor. Andy Trotter and Steve Heap were right behind me, and they took the brunt of the first charge from the rest of the gang. I don't really know why, but I just focused all my attention on this man I had hold of. I was squeezing his throat with my right hand whilst looking directly into his eyes. Certain throat holds can cause a certain amount of paralysis in the human body, and apparently I was using one at that time. I saw the bravado vanish and the fear appear as he realised he was helpless. Then the fear turned into panic as he found he could no longer breathe properly. "I can't breathe," he gasped. "I can't breathe." I bent lower so he could hear me and said, "Don't you think I know that? And the last thing you're ever going to see." I carried on squeezing. The next thing I remember was hearing Pete's voice saying, "Steve, it's over. You can let him go now." I didn't really want to, but I looked up to see what was happening. Sure enough, all the tow rags had been battered and were corralled into the locked conservatory that faced the river. I still didn't want to let go, but I did in the end. Peter turned to the cowering team and told them to pick up your friend and do one. It turned out that after the first charge, Andy and Steve Heap had been pushed backwards past the point where I had hold of this geezer. The tow rags had swarmed all over me, trying to get me off their pal, but I didn't notice. Andy picked up a stool and started laying into them. Steve was also moving forward again. Then Peter came back from his office where he had been to collect his baseball bat. Now, Pete isn't shy about using weapons, and his attack came from the rear, and it completely broke them. The pub had apparently emptied at the start of the trouble. As we were having a medicinal brandy, Steve Heap showed us one of his thumbs. It had very nearly been bitten straight through. I was also starting to feel some pain. The back of my head was one big lump where I'd been repeatedly hit. Lifting my sweatshirt revealed numerous bite marks and boot prints. Steve Heap would have to go to the hospital with his thumb. It was in a proper mess. I asked Peter how much damage he thought he had done with the bat. He replied, "A fair bit. I got some good hits in." "Why?" "Because there's a good chance that some of them will be there." I borrowed a straight razor from Pete and headed to the hospital with Andy and Steve. We left Pete looking after his pub in a sulk because he couldn't come with us. On arrival at Hope Hospital, we entered the accident and emergency department. We immediately saw the group of men that had been at the Adelphi Riverside. We booked Steve in at the triage desk for treatment. Steve tried to say it was a dog bite, but they could tell the difference. Then Andy and I went to have a quick follow-up with the lads. They were so busy talking amongst themselves that they didn't notice us approach. They were sat by the gents' toilets, and so they were used to men going past them and into the toilet. It was only when we actually stood right in front of them that they looked up and down. It was like something from a cartoon. All their jaws dropped at the same time, and their eyes nearly popped out of their heads. Not one of them moved. Looking at their faces, I could not see my pal with the tattoos, or the kid I suspected was their main boy. When I asked them where he was, one of them lifted his arm and pointed at a soundproof telephone booth across the room. "Nice one, son." They still didn't move as we turned and headed over to the phone booth. I took up a position directly behind the man on the phone. He was talking to someone about what had happened earlier, so I just waited patiently. It took a few seconds for him to realise that someone was stood right behind him. Glancing quickly round, he registered my face and must have thought of me as someone he knew, because he smiled at me and carried on talking. Less than a second later, his brain must have placed me in the right compartment, because he just dropped the telephone and started to scream for help. I had reached into my back pocket for the cutthroat razor and was bringing it up with the full intention of slitting his nose right down the middle. Andy grabbed my arm and said, "Steve, it's the old Bill." Looking over his shoulder, I saw that 2 traffic police had entered A&E. Looking back at my intended victim, I smiled and said, "Lucky boy." With that, we turned and walked away. Returning to the Adelphi pub after Steve Heap had been treated, we sat up most of the night, waiting to see if we would get a surprise visit. We were woken by a couple of officers from Salford CID banging on the door. When they interviewed Peter about the previous night's entertainment, they asked him if a Mr. Sinclair from Blackpool was still here. Peter looked suitably shocked until they explained that they had PNC'd the registrations of the cars in the car park, and the black Audi with the A5 GBH number had come up with my name and address. They told us that they did not want a war breaking out between Salford and Blackpool. They had already contacted Blackpool police once they had P&C'd my car registration and been given my history. I explained to them that we were just in the right place at the right time, as far as my friend Peter was concerned, and that we had no intention of starting anything. It turned out that there was a police informer within the gang of men from the night before, and that he had phoned the police and told them that the gang were planning to kill the landlord in retaliation for what had happened. Peter was moved out of the Adelphi Riverside by his company, who put a new landlord into the pub and changed it into a student bar named the Old Pint Pot. Sometime later, I heard that this landlord had agreed to pay the going rate as requested by these gangs. This worked out at £50 a week. Unbelievable. So that was the explosive encounter from Stephen Sinclair, and the extract was from the Blackpool Rock, which is Stephen Sinclair's book, which was published quite some time ago. The link's in the description and in the comments. He dedicates a chapter in that book, as well as this turnout with the some kind of Salford mob over a protection racket of a friend's pub that I've just described. He's also got a chapter which you'll have to read about in the book itself, where he meets Rab Carruthers and Paul Ferris and talks about Billy Ferris, Paul Ferris's brother, who had a relationship with one of his family members. So that's definitely worth getting a book for just that alone. But it's a fantastic book detailing his life prior to him working the doors, and then throughout his door days, including a row he had with the Stoke lads, the Stoke football firm, the Naughty 40, which he goes into detail on in that book as well. Although my friend Mark Chester also details that book in that encounter, and his may be a little bit slightly different, but those two ended up working the door together later on when Mark Chester was looking after a family member who wasn't well in Blackpool, and he moved there. So all that's really interesting is in the book. Paul Massey, we know, was brutally executed by someone who was working for a firm. I think it was the A-team. There's two sections of the A-team. They were having a battle. Paul somehow got drawn in, or they used him to try and antagonize the other group. And unfortunately, he lost his life. But he was greatly respected, and still is, in the Manchester, Salford areas and across the country. People talk highly about Paul Massey. I know Paddy Comrie and Bull on the Paddy Comrie's channel in the North East. He talks about his great friendship with Paul Massey after meeting him in prison, etc. So, yeah, interesting little anecdote that was. I thought I'd bring it to you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the likes, hit the subscribe if you haven't already. I try and get videos up Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, sometimes Sundays, if all's running smoothly. So, yeah, until next time, that's me out.